Hello, I'm Robert CANO, author of The Suffering and the Dark Archer and the soon-to-be-released The Shadow Cult. I have been writing in various stages for at least 20 years through various means. Started in poetry, so I have probably well over about 500 poems, some of which have been published, and I'm currently working with a publisher to get a book of poetry out.
Yep, so the name says I'm Amber MORANT. I've been writing for a couple decades now. Some of it's starting to be more of a Asian influence. My current series is Dragon Guardian Wars. I've probably written well over 1,000,000 words and stuff since I've started writing when I was younger.
Hi, I'm ANITA Stewart. I write under AF Stewart. I have a epic fantasy trilogy, right there, published, and I also write horror, and I also write poetry. So that's me.
Hi, I am Seal Cannon. I go by Courtney. I am a multi-genre author who writes mostly fantasy and sci-fi, and I'm also the owner of Fiction Atlas Press, and we mostly publish fantasy and sci-fi.
As I like to do with this show, I'm going to start off by reading the Wikipedia definition, which classifies it as high fantasy, but it does say high fantasy or epic fantasy is a subgenre of fantasy, defined either by the epic nature of its setting or by the epic nature of its characters, themes, or plot. High fantasy is set in an alternative fiction secondary world rather than real or primary world. The secondary world is usually internally consistent, but the rules differ from those of a primary world. By contrast, low fantasy is characterized by being set in the primary or real world or a rational, familiar fictional world with inclusion of the magical elements. So that's a pretty quick definition for even Wikipedia, who usually is much more long-winded than I am, which is hard to believe, but that is usually the case.
Well, it's kind of right, because high fantasy and epic fantasy technically are two separate subgenres. Although, really, I get them confused. So, if you want to lump them together, that's fine by me. But high fantasy is usually something that has like elves and traditional fantasy characters.
Mm.
And epic fantasy usually has some kind of epic quest or epic stakes to it. It's the way it was explained to me. So,
and both could have.
Oh yeah,
but yeah,
but high fantasy usually pretty much has to have some sort of traditional fantasy character, whereas epic fantasy doesn't necessarily have to have it.
Mm.
At least that's how it was explained to me, and I'm sticking by it.
I think that's probably pretty much right on. This is Wikipedia after all. We can yell at them. It's all right.
Well, it could, the definition of high fantasy and epic fantasy confuses authors who actually write in the genre. So poor Wikipedia can't get it right. That's for sure.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing because a lot of these definitions, they bleed into one another, and so there are, for instance, in my book, there are elements of steampunk, even though there's none of that actually mentioned anywhere. There are elements of high fantasy, there are elements of dark fantasy, there are elements of epic fantasy. All of these things come together to create its own story. And so, it's important that, yes, there's these different subgenres, but it's also, I think, for me at least, it's important to remember that all of these subgenres work together and none are necessarily higher or lower than another.
At least for me, when I look at epic fantasy, it's definitely includes more of the political, and not so much always like, oh, the ruler, but also just in general political aspect into it versus and it doesn't have to have a high fantasy aspect. I've seen epics where it's very low fantasy. For instance, things like Game of Thrones where there's almost no magic, whereas high fantasy you might see mages throwing magic all over the place, a la like Dungeons and Dragons.
I'm pretty okay with the definition, except for I think sword and sorcery kind of comes in there as a subgenre kind of epic fantasy, and that's what I think of when I think of epic fantasy. I think of people that are either have magical abilities or they're fighting with swords. There's kings, there's queens, there's people with bows, like arcane weapons. I think historical whenever I think of epic fantasy.
So that being said, one thing that I guess we all agree upon that was mentioned in here that I think is really the backbone of fantasy is building the world and creating the world that your characters and your stories are going to exist in. And oftentimes there's always the debate: what comes first, the chicken or the egg, right? I mean, do we create the characters? Do we create the story? Do we create the world? So, and it's always different for each author, and each author has its own process. So, but at the same token, for fantasy, there's no getting around it. You have to build a world. You have to create something that, because you are about to, especially for epic, you're about to embark on a vast journey that probably carries a lot of terrain and different things that the characters are going to experience within the story. So, what is your approach to the process? Is the world building something you do before, during, or after?
With my trilogy, there's 7 kingdoms in this world that are just barely mentioned in the trilogy, but I know all about them and what kind of cultures they have and what kind of creatures they have and stuff like that. So, but none of that ever got into the book.
Where did you start with? Did you start with the world, or did you start with the characters and story and build around it?
I start with the idea, like the original idea the story's based on, and then okay, what kind of world are we going to build here? What kind of characters are going to be in the world? And it sort of evolves together, characters and the world, for me.
I have to agree with Anita. For me, it always starts with an idea, and then we evolve it towards, like, you think of usually my ideas revolve around 1 or 2 characters, and it usually starts out for me as a dialogue piece. And so I kind of build everything around that, and I think about what environment they're going to be in. And then I'm like an information freak. So I have like spreadsheets and things that say, the religions, the topography, everything that's about the world. I kind of get to the nitty gritty of it, but I don't actually need to say, tell everything. I just need to know it myself so I can visualize the world, and from all that information kind of craft a character as a complete person.
One of the things that I do is I usually build my characters first and kind of think of the situations that they'll end up being in. But I'm also one of those people that I'll world build everything out before I start writing, because there's so many things that I may not say outright when I'm actually writing the manuscript, but it might come up briefly of how a character reacts. So if, let's say, one person with religion, they worship this kind of deity that's all about fire, that area is probably going to have a lot more imagery of flames versus if I don't even think about what their religion is, and it kind of takes away from the richness of the settings.
I think for me, I'm probably more backwards here. I have a tendency to work with the world building first. So the world in my head has been around for 10 years or so. I didn't publish The Suffering until January of 2018. So there's a lot there where I have to really think about where I've had time to think about the world and how it looks and what kind of races are in there and the different dynamics involved between the different peoples and everything else. So usually when I sit down to actually start fleshing out the story, I actually will start with an idea of like notes of the narrative, right? And so that's not typically how I start the book, um, because what I need is a starting point that's already found within the world that I've built up, right? And so I'll start telling like one little bit of the story, and usually I'll just do like a really descriptive narrative, very purple prosy thing that nobody will ever read in a million years. But I do that just for me, and usually I do it as a exercise. I do a lot of little exercises like that, and then that really gets me ready for actually writing the story. Because a lot of times I start story out with dialogue, and so the dialogue just kind of needs to be natural and needs to feel natural, and the setting needs to feel natural, and so that helps me kind of get in that zone.
I don't think there's ever a more truer genre that this statement belongs to than this one, and that is the devil's in the details, right? I mean, this genre has a lot, it's throwing a lot at you. It's always constantly, and it's evolving, and you know, we've gone from info dumping to subtleties to prologues to epilogues to all kinds of different ways in which we get the information across, and so, uh, you all probably grew up with the older fantasies and the things that probably made you want to write fantasy. A lot of those had a lot of info dumping and a lot of prologuing and epiloguing as well. And for you, that's probably exciting, but you know that your audience is a lot different now. So how have you managed to balance that? Is it become a balancing act? Have you thought? Is that something you really think about? That the audiences are much different, the attention spans are much different, or are you just writing what you want to write and just if it's not accepted, it's not accepted? I mean, is there something to be said for that method as well?
Definitely, I can say that for sure. That I've definitely thought about those things.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the day, I don't care, because I do me, right? And while I avoided prologues, I did not avoid epilogues. My epilogue's set up for whatever is coming next. It's actually a bit of a tradition now, so I'm like, I'm going to keep it. But with that being said, when I'm looking at telling my story, I don't pay attention to conventions. I know that it's like, there's these rules, right? They're more like guidelines, and I don't follow them. So, only you said, right?
Mm-hmm.
I hate that. I've read books like that, and they're horribly difficult to get through. I can't do it, and so I'm like, well, why do I want to be that person, right?
Right.
And it's not to say that it doesn't always work, because it does sometimes. But I think in fantasy specifically, your voice needs to echo the world that you've created. And maybe I'm alone there, but that's how I have approached my fantasy world. Is I want the voice of my narrator, whoever that is, or the third person, telling that I'm doing. I want that to echo the world that we're in. And so that setting all of a sudden becomes more immersive, because your mind, as you're reading my story, is going into that mode. And I've actually been told that it works, because a lot of my readers have said, once I slowed down and I wasn't trying to burn through your book, it became incredibly enjoyable, right? But it was a mindset, and that was a risk I was willing to take.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I write the story as the story comes to me, whether it has a prologue or it doesn't have a prologue or whatever. I mean, the characters tell me what story they want, what their story is, and I write it down, is basically. So, yeah. I mean, the marketing, you try and fit the books into the marketing, at least I try and fit the books into the marketing after they're done, not try and fit the marketing into the books.
Kind of use more of like a breadcrumb sort of deal where I go with different different points of view and reveal details throughout the book to kind of create one big picture. I have fiddled with doing a prologue before, but I ended up scrapping it. But epilogues, I think, are fun and acceptable.
Yeah, I'm definitely one of those things where I think about how the character, because I'll try to do as close of a point of view as I can, and I'll think about the character and what information is even important to them. And with multiple point of views, one chapter may get a lot more info dumpy than the other, because that's what their mindset is about trying to gain as much information and regurgitating as much of that as they can, versus another person that's not even caring about that. And that kind of adds a little bit more of that voice, kind of like what Robert was saying, of seeing how the world is and getting that voice of each character in their own way. I also do a little breadcrumbs as well, so it's interesting. And then with epilogues, I don't call them an epilogue. It's just the final chapter of the book, to kind of be like, yeah, it's an epilogue, but is it really? Is it really?
You know, also along the lines of the devil's in the details is the idea that this is a unique genre in that you don't find many first-person stories told in this genre. It's usually a third-person narrator. You know, it's a different voices. You're switching POVs. You know, a lot of times there's multiple POVs in a lot of these stories as well. And I know that's by design because the details have to be presented, right? And but that being said, is that one of the rules you were talking about? Rules, Robert, and I think that is one of the rules that are pretty inherent in this genre. Is that one of the rules that nobody's willing to break, or just haven't tried it, or is it just doesn't work for what you guys are trying to do?
Well, I mean, as far as head hopping, I do that, and I do that within chapters, which is actually not typically done. So I mess around with a lot of experimental stuff. Like I said, I don't like rules, and I will purposely break them just to see if I can get them to work. So one of the things I was looking at specifically for that was Tolkien. Once we get to Two Towers, we see that the storyline starts to shift. So we're following characters all the way through to the end of that particular storyline for that book, right? And the problem is that we have no sense of time for these characters. Yeah. We don't know where, if the book ends with all of them at the same time point, which they don't, right? But as you're reading, you don't know that. Instead of doing that, I head hop within chapters, and I focus on a specific time frame. In this time frame, things are happening, and then when I head hop, I'm basically still in that time frame, but with another character. Ended up working out pretty well.
The epic fantasy stuff I've written so far has been third person, although the contemporary fantasy I'm currently writing is first person. So we'll see how it goes. But yeah, the story dictates the point of view for me, and it always will.
Do you feel like, though, with the third person aspect of it, it just feels more natural to tell that story that way?
It's better in scope for epic, because when you're doing first person, you can't show the other character's point of view. It's like it's all distilled through the main character. But with the third person, you can move it out, and you, like with my trilogy, I showed the villain's point of view, I showed the secondary character point of views. So yeah, it's less restrictive when you're doing third person in epic fantasy, and it gives a better scope.
Yeah, and I think another thing about epic fantasy, they tend to have a larger cast. A lot of them, not every epic fantasy, but I feel like fantasy books in general have more characters to keep up with. So like Anita said, if you're only seeing the point of view of one character, and it just kind of limits you and what you can tell. I have written in both first person and third person, but I find third person is a lot easier when you're writing fantasy to just show all the details that you need to, and not feel like you're having to make up some reason why this character knows this information or some convenient way for them to know something.
With me, I write also the multiple point of views and stuff, but I do each chapter as its own point of view kind of thing, even if it's slightly different times. But it's also, when I say with rules, I definitely look at them as guidelines, but I also sit there to try to understand why that rule exists in order to break it. Because if I don't understand why that rule is there for certain aspects of point of views and why certain books follow that, if I can't understand that, then how am I going to be able to, how am I actually breaking it? Am I just ignoring it and tossing it in the trash, or am I actually doing it to subvert the genre and understand what would work better for me?
That's an excellent point. Understanding the rules is I think very important. That's how you know how you're breaking them and how you know when you're breaking them and the reason why. So I definitely, that's a very good point.
So it took me 11 episodes and one season of this show to admit something freely that I've never said publicly to anybody at any time, especially to my fantasy friends, and that I harbor a professional jealousy with fantasy authors. And the one jealousy that I have of what fantasy authors are able to accomplish is one of my favorite things in the world to do, which is to make the world gray. It could be the hero that you never expected, you know, a la Frodo, or you could have Samwise Gamgee, who had this courage inside of him the whole time, just waiting to come out. You have your anti-heroes like Paul Atreides and you know the incredible worlds around them, and yet they have a tinge of evil. They have a sense of darkness in them, and then you have your villains who are so well defined and so well crafted that sometimes their mission is admirable in some respects. It's not always the wickedest of wickeds and evil, and there's some, you know, underlying idealism and ideology to it, and so I think with fantasy that is so apparent in a lot of really, really epic fantasy, especially. You know, it's not just the hero's going to kill the bad guy, right? There's so much more to it, and it's so much internalizing. And so I just wanted to get that out there. You know, they say the first step in admitting you have a problem is to admit it, so I'm admitting it right now. But it's the one thing. It's the one reason why I would ever write a fantasy. I don't have the patience and the mindset for the world building or anything like that, but the character building and the greatness behind it is really interesting. And I'm wondering from all of you, is that something you really love to play with? Is that really the meat of why you love fantasy, is because you can do that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know my characters. None of them are nice. I mean, actually, this trilogy probably has the nicest characters I've ever written in it. You know, and the main character, even he's got this badass power that you see in the middle of the first book that is not nice.
And for you, Anita, which is something very specially, is that you really harness the villain. The villain is something very important to you as well.
Oh yeah, yeah. I love the villain in this trilogy, the Nightmare Crow. He's not evil. He does bad things to gain the one thing he wants.
Right.
And you find this out at the end of the series, and so he's so obsessed with this. It's kind of clouds his judgment, and he does all these things just to get the one thing he wants back. So he's not exactly evil. And then, of course, there's Death, who's the lead character's mother, and she's not evil, but she's not good either. And she's just sort of like a force of nature. But the most evil villain I do have is in the third book, and that's my pirate. And he's just flat out wicked. No redeeming characters at all. So yeah, but he was the most fun to write.
I think one of the most interesting things about fiction in general is that we take characters and we try to humanize them and try to kind of make reflections of ourselves and other people that we've met in our lives. And the the more backstory, the more gray that you make a character, the more human they are and the more relatable that they are. And fantasy lets us do that a lot. But that's one thing that I really do love is discovering why a character's motivations, why they turned out the way they did, what happened in their past, what is influencing them to maybe change for better or for worse. And I just think it's just like a really interesting thing. If you think about like some of the best characters that are out there in fantasy, if you think of well, like you mentioned, Sam. When you first meet Sam, you don't really think much of him. He's just kind of a little hobbit that likes gardening, and he's loyal to Frodo. But by the end of that trilogy, he becomes such a brave and endearing character, and you wouldn't have thought that from just reading the first few pages. And the same goes for more wiki characters. I just love origin stories, especially, and figuring out how to make somebody relatable.
For me, one of the best ways that I've done to make them relatable is by looking at people that I personally don't like and stuff in the real world and put my mind into theirs and being like, what makes you tick and why do I think you're evil, but what in your mind makes you think that you're actually the good person in your story? And kind of using that to my advantage of writing characters to create that gray idea, because they're obviously looking at themselves as the good guy in their own story, whether they're doing good actions or bad, and whether they're also the villain or the hero, because everyone's always the protagonist in their own story.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, my main character is a wraith, guys, like soul-sucking wraith, right? And yet he's the most honorable person you could probably find, and yet you come to find out that his background wasn't always so honorable. He tried, but that was all he could do was try. I mean, at the end of the day, he was a soldier, and he was at the whim of powers greater than him. And then he becomes a wraith, and he has to try and accommodate for his physical needs, and it's difficult because he's dealing with pretty intense thirst and hunger that can only be satiated through taking life, and he doesn't want to do that, but what is he supposed to do? And so it's funny because I've actually had a reader tell me that all of my characters are nice, and it's ironic, I think, in a way, just because I don't look at the world that way, but I created a world where there's a lot of respect. And I also wanted to juxtapose that with who we end up finding out is the real villain. No spoilers. So that was something that was kind of tricky to do. And I think being able to manipulate that aspect of it, by looking at or dealing with people in a more honorable way, juxtaposing the villain in that direction really helped to kind of solidify what I was aiming to accomplish with it.
So how do you guys manage your rosters? What are some things that you do that you feel like help your process and keep it all together?
No one manages their character. I mean, you try to manage your characters. Right. You make little lists. You make little background, and then the characters go, nope, that's not how it's gonna go. You're gonna do this.
You have some divas there, though, Anita, that like some smaller characters go, oh hell no, I'm bigger than that. I'm gonna be a bigger character. Sorry.
Yeah, occasionally, but mostly they just refuse to listen to what I tell them to do, and they say, no, this is my motivation. You have to write me this way.
It's really fun when they decide they want to change their name.
They do it halfway in book 2, and then you have to change everything for book 3. And yeah.
Yes. Everything Anita just said.
Yeah. I have notes. That's about it. They're notes. Subject to change. So